Okay, so this is my assignment 4.3.2 on qualitative data collection. So firstly, qualitative data is based on feelings and opinions. It's subjective and it consists of things such as questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, observations. These are all ways in which qualitative data can be collected, and we'll go through these in this assignment. So an example, I could interview young female Great British gymnasts to find out whether they feel pressure in competition or not. So firstly, there's interviews. So this is just a number of ways in which a good interview can be conducted. So the interviewer must listen intently, be flexible, so be willing to kind of adapt in the situation, balance open questions as well as closed questions. So closed questions, so you could maybe have a question, a simple question, yes or no question on whether a gymnast feels pressure in competition, and then if they say yes, you could then go on to ask an open question as to why this is, maybe. Probe gently and follow up with questions, and also build a rapport. So this is essentially like building a relationship with the interviewee so that they feel comfortable. And some ethical issues within interviews are privacy and consent. So the person being interviewed, the interviewee, must give consent for this interview that they actually want to take part because it's voluntary, and it should all be kept confidential. So the data shouldn't just be made public, it should be kept confidential by the interviewer, and also there should be debriefing and support. So firstly, one form of interview is an unstructured interview. These have an initial start question, and then from there the conversation flows. So there isn't a plan for these interviews. The interviewer must think of the questions on the spot, essentially, and this requires the researcher to be quite skilled, because they need to have the ability to think of questions on the spot in the moment without having any plan of what they're going to ask beforehand. So an example of an unstructured interview could be that I could interview young female Great British gymnasts, and I could make the start question, do you feel uncomfortable about body image when participating in gymnastics? And from there, from her answer, I could then carry on this conversation, and based on how they answer. So advantages of this is it's more informal, so the interviewee is likely to feel more comfortable because it's a bit more relaxed, and yeah, it's more informal environment. Makes these interviews more valid because participants, because they're more comfortable and feeling more relaxed in the scenario, they're more likely to say what they want to say. The researcher can be more flexible with these interviews, and the disadvantages are that it's harder to compare between participants, because obviously if you do an unstructured interview with one individual and then another unstructured interview with another individual, they're going to be very different because they don't have a structure, so one interview could go very differently to another. And lastly, there's a small sample as its length, and it's time consuming. So if you're just doing this with one individual, then yeah, it's going to take a long time. So semi-structured interviews. In semi-structured interviews, you follow a guide, but there is also scope for probing further questions. So these are to get any additional information from the interview. For example, I could have a set structure of questions, all to do with pressure for young female Great British gymnasts, and then a gymnast states that, I don't know, maybe their brother makes them feel anxious when they're performing. I could then ask further questions to discover why this is. So an advantage of semi-structured interview is that there's some guided questions for the researcher, so they do have some questions planned which they know they're going to ask. but there is also flexibility as well. So there's sort of both sides with a semi-structured interview, and it's detailed. However, the disadvantages are you can't guarantee honesty of the interviewee because, for example, with my scenario, there could be quite but the reason that her brother makes her feel anxious could be something she doesn't want to share. So you can't guarantee she's going to be honest. And flexibility can also lessen the reliability. And there's structured interviews. So this is an interview where there's a set guide and you adhere to it regardless of any response from the interviewee. So I could interview young female Great British gymnasts on how they train for national gymnastic events with a structured layout of questions. So the advantages to this is you solely focus on the specific topic. You stay on one topic and you don't come away from it. It's easier to analyse this because you're going to be asking everyone the same questions. So there's going to be these are essentially more reliable because the results will be more repeatable. And the interviewer doesn't need to be as skilled and they'll require less training because they've simply got to follow a guide of questions rather than having to think of them off the top of their head. And the disadvantages are that the researcher must stick to the guide. So even if the interviewee provided an answer which kind of could have led to further questions, the researcher must go on to then just ask whatever the next question is, regardless of this. And also, the participant is forced to answer from a limited choice of answers. So this could make them feel slightly more uncomfortable and less willing to give truthful answers. So now moving on to focus groups. So this is when an interviewer carries out an interview with a group of people who all contribute their feelings and opinions. So for example, I could carry an interview with 6 female Great British gymnasts on what their diet consists of, perhaps. So advantages is you can obtain consensus of opinion, so you can kind of get a general idea from the whole group. You can observe group dynamics as well, so just see how the group works, just generally see how they sort of get along with each other and how they work. And disadvantages are that certain individuals may not be so confident. So some of the individuals may be really high in confidence, so they'll provide loads of answers for the interviewer. However, some, for example, I don't know, maybe 2 of these 6 females might be quite unconfident and shy, and they won't want to speak up and say anything different, and therefore you're not actually getting results representative of the whole group. And the researcher must be skilled for this because they need to be able to control a large group of people, essentially, so that's not that easy to do. Moving on, so questionnaires. A questionnaire is a set of written questions with a choice of answers for a statistical study. For example, I could devise a questionnaire for young female Great British gymnasts all about their sport, and I could do a combination of yes or no questions with some questions which also contain the option to agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or neither agree or disagree. Because questionnaires they tend to have quite a lot of closed questions, but then you can also put in some agree and disagree questions to mix it up, and then also some closed questions, so maybe you can ask why certain answers have been given. And ethical issues, again, the same as interviews. Privacy and consent, so consent must be given for these. Protection, so the data should be kept confidential, shouldn't be made public at all. And again, debriefing and support. So the advantages to questionnaires, they're cheap and quick. there's less interpersonal influence. So the researcher isn't actually present when the questionnaire is completed, so there's less participant bias. Also, questionnaires can be anonymous, so it makes someone feel more comfortable about giving a truthful answers, essentially, because they don't necessarily have to give their name and show that they're the one that thinks these things. They can just remain anonymous. And disadvantages are social desirability, so someone might answer in a certain way just to kind of look good to the public. So if there's a poor design and poor data can be obtained, so it needs good questions, ideally not just lots of closed questions, because not much can really be taken from these. And response rates are actually very low with questionnaires, so many individuals don't fully complete them or even complete them at all, so it's not representative of a whole sample. And lastly, another way of collecting qualitative data is observation. So behaviours are observed and recorded. There's no manipulation of any variables, and this is the opposite of a true experiment, because in a true experiment variables are manipulated, so the independent variable, and yeah, this is completely the opposite of that. And so firstly, there's participant and non-participant observation. Participant observation is when the observer fully takes part in the action whilst observing. Non-participant observation is when the observer doesn't take part at all and simply observes. Also, there's disclosed and undisclosed observation. So disclosed is when the observer observes as either a participant or non-participant and reveals their role as an observer to the group. So this will make the group aware that they are being observed, and now they may react to this in a certain way. And there's undisclosed observation, which is when the observer observes as either a participant or non-participant, but doesn't reveal their role as an observer, so it might be unknown to the group. And there's also covert observation, which is when the researcher observes participants by blending in. So they could just turn up maybe one time to a training session with young female Great British gymnasts and just take part without any of the gymnasts knowing that this is an observer. Or there's overt, which is when the researcher could turn up and inform the participants straight away that they will be observed. And also there's time sampling, which is used in qualitative observations. This is used to observe behaviours or events that occur in a period of time. For example, I could observe young female Great British gymnasts, and at the first minute of every 20 minutes I could record how many errors the gymnasts make. This would then give me a rough idea of how many they'd make in total in the whole session. So say the session was an hour, I could then get 3 minutes worth of errors and then make a calculation to get a general idea of how many errors they may have made in the whole session. And advantages of observation: so it's immediate, it's in the moment, it acts as a preliminary research tool, so behaviours can be identified for further studies. It's high in ecological validity, so there's a real life application in a natural setting. However, disadvantages are ecological validity could be lowered if observations were carried out in a lab. Observer effect, so the presence of the observer could actually affect the behaviours of the participants. If they know they're being observed, the chances are their effort levels are going to increase and they're going to really put a lot into it. So it could be argued that maybe this isn't actually that much of a natural setting. And lastly, this is time consuming because it quite often requires video analysis, which would take a long time to break down. So yeah, that's my assignment 4.3.2.